It started out as just a normal day in my small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever seemed to happen. I was scrolling through my phone, lost in the haze of social media, when I came across a post that caught my attention. It was a local mom sharing how her house had burned down in a freak accident. She lost everything, her possessions, her family photos, even her children's toys. My heart ached for her, but as I read the comments, I noticed something strange. Instead of the typical sympathy, the comments quickly turned to bitterness and accusations. Many posters seemed to doubt the sincereness of her need, insinuating it was a ploy to get money or attention. I didn't understand it. This was a mother in distress. I had always thought our community was close-knit, but maybe I was wrong. A few days later, I attended a neighborhood meeting as I always did, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But the atmosphere was tense. People were whispering about the incident, and soon enough someone mentioned the mom and her supposed lies. I felt a surge of anger rising inside me. This woman didn't deserve this treatment. I stood up, shouting about the importance of community and support. Surprisingly, faces softened around me as my words hung in the air, but it didn't change anything. Instead, I was met with a handful of nods and a full spectrum of uncomfortable glances. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the mom and her plight. I decided to take action. I created a GoFundMe page for her, detailing the tragedy and emphasizing that we, as a community, needed to rally behind her. I was sure that others would want to help. No one could be that callous, right? I shared the link on social media, and at first, the response was positive. Donations trickled in, and I felt a sense of hope. I even received messages of encouragement from friends who expressed their admiration. But soon, negativity crept in again. A few familiar names from the earlier comments started to lash out at my decision. They accused me of throwing money at a scam and called me naive for trusting a stranger. Each time I read one of those comments, a little piece of my enthusiasm crumbled. I prepared myself for the worst, but by the end of the week, I was stunned to see that we'd made a significant dent in the goal. I thought about how proud that mother would be, and how much this support might mean to her. But just as I was feeling optimistic, I received a message on the GoFundMe platform from an unknown user. The message was cryptic and alarming. "Stop while you can. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I felt a chill run down my spine. I dismissed it as just another troll, but the creeping paranoia followed me everywhere, tainting every donation notification with suspicion. The guilt of disrupting the community weighed heavily on me. I swear I could hear whispers every time I stepped outside. It felt as if the townspeople were all staring at me, scrutinizing my every move. I went to buy groceries one day, and as I strolled down the aisle, I overheard two people whispering about me and the GoFundMe. "I can't believe he's so gullible," one said. "Doesn't he know that's just a sad story?" I bolted out of the store, my heart racing. That evening, I decided to confront my fears and went to the mother's neighborhood. I knocked on her door, prepared to give her the cash I had managed to collect. I thought it might clear my conscience. When she opened the door, her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She looked surprised to see me, but she welcomed me in. I handed her the cash with a trembling hand, and in her eyes, I saw gratitude, fear, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. As we talked, she shared her story, how long she'd been struggling even before the fire, how it felt to be viewed with suspicion now that she needed help. I felt her earnestness seep into my bones. But even as I sat there, listening, the message echoed in my mind: "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Was it possible she was hiding something? I left her house feeling more confused than ever. Days passed, and the donations continued to roll in, but so did the hostility. People started to escalate their efforts to discredit the mother, even going as far as to post her old photos, claiming they were evidence of her supposed riches. All of it felt so alienating. Conflicted and overwhelmed, I found myself retreating deeper into my shell, avoiding my friends, my community, and even my family. Then came the night that would change everything. I was jolted awake by an urgent knock on my door. My heart thundered as I peered through the peephole. I saw the mom, drenched in rain, face pale and shivering. I opened the door, alarmed. "Please, I need to talk," she gasped, stepping inside. Quickly, she asked me to lock the door and told me about something sinister happening. There were people snooping around her house, and she suspected it was someone from our community. I felt an overwhelming urge to protect her. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, knowing I could potentially be putting myself at risk. She whispered, "Just come with me." Against my better judgment, I agreed, and she led me to a car parked a few blocks away, dimly lit by the streetlights. Nerves twisted in my stomach as I slipped into the passenger seat, and she drove us into the dark outskirts of town. My mind raced, filled with questions. Eventually, we arrived at an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. When she parked, she turned to me, her eyes wide with desperation. "I know this looks crazy, but if I'm right, we can expose the real truth," she whispered, glancing around nervously. The warehouse echoed around us, filled with shadows and lingering uncertainties. As she explained, a chilling story unfolded. She claimed a ring of local con artists had been targeting individuals in crisis. They had set her up to take the fall, and it was only a matter of time before they decided to come for me and anyone who had supported her. The stakes became painfully real as I realized how deep the deception ran. The dark humor of it all rang in my mind. Here I was trying to help, but now I was caught in someone else's game. The very suspicions that once haunted me began to swirl in the air between us. But in that moment, clarity struck me. Regardless of what was true or false, my community needed reminding that real support comes from honesty and compassion. We should never lose sight of that, no matter how dark things appeared. I took a deep breath and decided to face my fears. "We have to go back," I said, resolved. She hesitated but then nodded reluctantly. We returned to the neighborhood, and at the next town meeting, I stood up, trembling but determined. I shared everything I'd learned, exposing the lies and manipulation that had turned our community against this woman. My voice reverberated with concern, desperation, and hope. As I spoke, I witnessed the shift in the room. The scorn that had thickened the air began to dissipate, replaced by murmurs of shame and guilt. People seemed to recall a time when our town had been filled with kindness, when we had supported each other through our struggles instead of tearing each other down. Although fear was still evident, it felt like a collective awakening, a moment for healing. In the end, a wave of donations flooded in, not just the money but heartfelt gestures of kindness, clothes, furniture, and even emotional support. It was the moment I realized the power of community support. It didn't matter what had transpired. What truly mattered was our willingness to come together and uplift one another, regardless of our differences. As we wiped the slate clean, I looked at the mother, now filled with hope, and for the first time, I saw the promise of what we could become when we focused on the goodness we could achieve together. That day, I learned that while shadows may creep in, the light we share can be even stronger, if we let it. It was a dark and stormy night when I first stumbled upon the truth. I know that sounds cliché, but you'll understand soon enough why it matters. I had been chasing my dream of becoming a writer since I could remember, pouring my soul into stories, hoping to one day see my name on a bestseller list. The thrill of creating fictional worlds and the sheer joy of crafting intricate plots swept me away, but it was never enough. I was living paycheck to paycheck, working a dead-end job in a coffee shop just to afford the rent on my tiny studio. Every day, I'd scrawl thoughts into my battered notebook during my lunch breaks, dreaming of the day my words would jump off the page and resonate with others. I'd submit short stories to magazines, but rejection letters filled my inbox, often leaving me feeling more discouraged than before. Still, I pressed on because I believed one day I would create a masterpiece. One night, while aimlessly scrolling through a writer's forum, I discovered a thread titled "The Dark Side of Writing." Intrigued, I dove in, reading post after post filled with tragic tales of failed authors, backstabbing agents, and cursed manuscripts. One user, an ominous figure who went by the Watcher, posted a message that sent a chill down my spine. They claimed that the secret to success in the writing world lay not in talent or hard work, but in a ritual that could unlock unparalleled creativity. Curious and desperate, I clicked on their profile and found a personal blog that detailed their experience with this ritual. The Watcher described a ceremony involving an ancient text called the manuscribe, said to summon muses but requiring a high price, your very connection to reality. I was skeptical, of course. But the idea gnawed at me until I couldn't shake it. What if this was the key to what I needed? The last rejection letter I received had pushed me to the edge. I was tired of failing. I wanted to succeed at any cost, so I decided to look for the manuscribe. After nights of searching through various obscure second-hand bookstores and hidden corners of the internet, I finally found a seller who claimed to have it. The website was buried under pages of search results, a clear sign it was no ordinary book. When the package arrived, my heart raced. The wrapping was old, worn like it had been through some bizarre adventure of its own. The cover had faded symbols that seemed to pulse under the dim light of my apartment. I took it as a sign I had found something special. That night, I gathered supplies, a candle, a small bowl of salt, and a grimoire. I followed the instructions meticulously, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. I recited the incantation, feeling words surge through me, wrapping around my mind and filling me with the promise of creativity beyond my wildest dreams. The lights flickered as I uttered the final words, and I felt the air grow thick with energy. Suddenly, the candle blew out, plunging my tiny room into darkness. My heart raced, and I felt a presence, almost tangible, in the room with me. The writing muse had arrived, or so I thought. I could hear whispers, the echoes of countless voices intertwining with my thoughts. It all started to blur. The lines between my desires and their reality twisted impossibly. I fell into a deep sleep, a dreamless abyss that seemed to stretch for ages. When I woke up, it was morning. My first thought was to check my notebook, but something felt wrong. I flipped open the pages to discover they were filled with scrawled sentences that didn't belong to me, stories I never wrote, characters I never created. I rushed to my laptop and found dozens of documents with titles I didn't recognize. I read through page after page of brilliantly crafted prose, mind-boggling plots, and unforgettable characters I clearly did not conceive. It was exhilarating but terrifying. I was elated to discover these stories existed, but I had no memory of creating them. I began to share these stories online, initially claiming they were my own. They received immediate attention, and soon enough, I was receiving offers from publishers. My dream was finally coming true, but the entire time, a small voice nagged at the back of my mind, a whisper of doubt. After a few months, I found myself at a local literary festival, standing at a booth dedicated to my now published works. I smiled for the camera, waved to fans who wanted autographs, but I felt hollow inside. A lurking emptiness began to consume me. I had given up pieces of myself without even realizing it. One night, I couldn't sleep, the weight of this growing unease pressed hard against my chest. I flipped through the pages of the manuscript, searching for answers, clues, anything. But as I read, my heart dropped. The final pages, the ones with the instructions for the ritual, weren't anywhere to be found. I felt panicked, like I had dropped my lifeline into a void. Desperate for clarity, I reached out to the watcher through the forum, begging for advice. Days passed with no reply, and my anxiety turned into a spiral of paranoia. What if I had unleashed something dark within myself? I began to read the stories I had written for days, trying to find a hint or a signal. Then I discovered something chilling. The protagonists in these stories were eerily similar to people I knew. Friends, co-workers, even family were woven into the narratives, but not as heroes. They were tortured shadows, reflecting their dark sides and insecurities. I felt sick. It was almost as if this entity, this muse I had summoned, didn't just gift me stories, it wanted to destroy them, to consume their essence through my words. I tried to write my own story again, but nothing came. I sat in front of the blank page for hours, writing and deleting over and over again, my own voice drowned out by the murmurs of the narratives already created. My pen trembled in fear as I felt it navigate toward darker themes that weren't mine but were pulled from the nether. I realized I was no longer chasing the dream I had envisioned. I was being puppeteered by my demons, and my imagination had become a prison. I had to put an end to it. So, I decided to confront the watcher on the writing forum. I posted a direct message, pleading for help and warning others about the manuscript. The response was swift, unexpected. A user named Read102 wrote, "You've dug too deep, haven't you? The stories are not yours to own. Burn it. You must burn the manuscript before it claims more than you realize." I felt a rush of cold air as the realization set in. The ritual wasn't merely a trick but a binding, trapping my identity and amplifying my fears. I gathered the courage, my heart racing, and raced back to my apartment. The moment I held the book in my hands again, I felt the tug of something sinister, a connection I wasn't ready to sever. But nothing mattered, I had to destroy it. With shaking hands, I doused it in lighter fluid and set it aflame outside my apartment. As it burned, I felt pieces of myself slip away in the smoke. I hadn't just given up my dreams, I had surrendered my reality to a darker ambition. The flames flickered and danced before finally collapsing in on themselves. The fire was consuming the book, but as it disintegrated, I heard grim whispers echoing around me. "You can't escape us." I recoiled, my heart pounding as an icy breeze enveloped me, chill whispering in my ear. The moment I realized I was chasing the wrong dream wasn't when I burnt the manuscript, but when I glimpsed the shadows creeping at the edges of my mind, reminding me that ambition can sometimes lead you to places where the price is far too steep. I wish I could say it ended there, that I walked away unscathed, but the shadows still linger. Life moved on, but those stories, those characters, they have a way of seeping back into my thoughts. I'm still writing, but never again with the same fervor. Now, I look over my shoulder, and every night I can feel the whispers haunt me, taunting me, waiting to see if I'll ever come back from my abandoned dreams. Make sure you choose your ambitions wisely. The moment you realize you're chasing the wrong dream can turn into a nightmare. I never thought I would have to learn how to manage stress in the way I did. It all started innocently enough. I was a typical college student, juggling classes, social life, and part-time work. But as the final exams approached, the pressure mounted. I stopped sleeping, my appetite plummeted, and anxiety became my constant companion. That's when I first learned about meditation. I downloaded an app, ready to give it a try, but I didn't expect it to lead me down a dark path. One night, as I sat cross-legged on my bed, eyes closed, I followed my breathing, focusing on the calm that was supposed to wash over me. But instead, I felt a pull, a whisper in my mind urging me to delve deeper, to uncover something beyond mere relaxation. I thought I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes, I felt like I was no longer alone in the room. The shadows were thicker, the corners seemed darker, and then, from that darkness, a figure seemed to emerge, not a person, but an entity, a swirling mass of energy that was both frightening and strangely comforting. I froze, confused, but it spoke to me in a voice that was both soothing and terrifying. "You've called me," it said. "Your stress has opened the door." I didn't know what to say. My heart raced as I tried to apply everything I knew about stress management, but it was too late. It continued, "I can help. I can show you how to rid yourself of this burden." My mind raced through the benefits of meditation. Was this some form of advanced stress relief? Out of desperation, I cautiously agreed. I never should have. The next few days were a blur. I followed its instructions. I meditated deeper, longer, trying to find that peace I was grasping for. But every time I closed my eyes, I was drawn further into this entity's world, an abyss of swirling colors and oppressive silence. It began to drain me, not just of energy, but of time. Hours slipped away while I floated in that eerie space, returning only to realize I had neglected classes, missed deadlines, and tormented my friends with my absence. They spotted my decline and tried to reach out, but I was too far gone, entranced by the entity's promises. "I have a way to alleviate your stress like no other. Embrace me, and you will learn to forget your worries entirely." Each time I surrendered to its voice, the stress that had been overwhelming me began to dissipate. But it was a false sense of calm, a deception that felt exhilarating but left a gaping hole where my motivation used to be. I thought I was winning, but I was merely losing myself. Days turned into weeks, and as finals passed, I realized that I had turned my life into a nightmare. I became almost a ghost, drifting through my days in a haze of indifference. Everything but that entity became unimportant. My friends worried. They witnessed my transformation, a descent into something unrecognizable. They tried to intervene, but I was so far gone that I could no longer distinguish their concern from an irritating distraction. Deep down, though, I sensed that something vital was shattering within me. One night, as I meditated, I felt a pang of longing for my old life, a fleeting memory of laughter, warmth, companionship. It snapped me back to reality, and I opened my eyes, staring into the void that had become my sanctuary. There was no comfort in this dark entity. It was a parasite feeding off my despair. In that moment of clarity, I screamed, desperate to reclaim myself. "Get out!" The entity faltered for a brief moment, and I took my chance. I willed myself to stand up, to break the cycle. I began to shout at the darkness that had woven itself into my life, rebuking the distorted comfort it offered. The room felt alive, vibrating in response to my cries. The shadows twisted and contracted, and I watched as the entity recoiled. "You can't leave. You won't realize your full potential without me." I felt the weight of its words, but enough was enough. Adrenaline surged through me, fueling the fierce desire to escape its grasp. I focused on everything that brought me joy: study groups with friends, late-night pizza runs, the scent of coffee after a long night of cramming for exams. I projected my will against the entity, harnessing everything, and suddenly the room exploded in brilliant light. For the first time, I truly felt in control. I couldn't tell you what happened next. It was as if a storm swept through my mind and body. My heart raced as I fought against the pull that dragged me into the abyss. I felt the entity writhing, burdened by my refusal to succumb. And then, like a bubble bursting, it vanished. Silence enveloped me, the shadows receding into nothingness. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, reality crashing back in. The room looked different in the aftermath. Color had returned to everything, and I felt lighter, like a heavy shadow had lifted. I went to sleep that night, and for the first time in weeks, I slept with ease. I awakened refreshed. With my resolve strengthened, I turned my focus toward cultivating a healthier approach to stress management. Meditation was no longer about allowing darkness in, it became a tool for clarity and mindfulness. I joined support groups, sought help from a counselor, and reconnected with my friends. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life, brick by brick, fueled by resilience. I came to realize that stress is an inevitable part of life, but the way we manage it is a choice. The experience remains etched in my memory. I learned to respect the balance between seeking help and finding strength within myself. Never again will I let despair open a door to the darkness. In the end, I didn't just learn to manage stress. I learned to fight against the shadows that lurk in the corners of our minds. And with that knowledge came an unfathomable power, the ability to embrace light, choose joy, and live with purpose, free from the clutches of that which seeks to chain us. I hadn't touched my guitar in nearly a decade. It sat in the corner of my room, a relic of my teenage years, collecting dust and nostalgia. Back then, music was everything to me. I spent countless nights strumming away, creating melodies that echoed the intensity of young love and heartbreak. But life happened. Responsibilities took over, and slowly but surely, my joy was suffocated beneath the weight of adulthood. I convinced myself I had outgrown it, convinced myself music was just a fleeting hobby. Then, last month, my grandmother passed away. She was my biggest supporter, the one who always believed I had something special with my music. After the funeral, a wave of grief washed over me, followed by anger. It was as if her death stripped me of my apathy, revealing a chasm where my passion used to thrive. I found myself raiding her old attic, searching for something, anything, that would reignite that lost fire. I uncovered a dusty, tattered journal filled with handwritten lyrics, poems, and ideas. As I thumbed through the pages, a familiar pang of longing washed over me. The words were raw, reflective. They were me. Inspired, I picked up my guitar for the first time since she passed. The strings felt foreign under my fingers, the act felt like reaching into an empty void, but I pressed on, determined. One night, while I was strumming aimlessly, I stumbled upon a haunting melody that seemed to just flow out of me, mingling with the lyrics from my grandmother's journal. I felt alive. I recorded the impromptu song on my phone, played it back repeatedly, drowning in the harmony of grief and creativity. Days turned into weeks, and I started to delve deeper into that creative well I thought had run dry. I played more, wrote more, and poured my heart into every note, resurrecting an old passion, which I discovered wasn't just about music, but the connection to my grandmother. I decided to perform at an open mic night in our small town, nervously signing up for a slot. The night was filled with talented musicians and a buzz of excitement. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing as I sat waiting for my turn. I listened to others pour their souls into their performances, some with stories like mine. When it was finally my turn, the room fell silent. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on me. I took a deep breath, strumming the first chords of that haunting melody I created. As I sang the first verse, I could see a spark of recognition in the crowd, a growing connection. I could almost see my grandmother's smile in the faces of those listening, hear her clapping in spirit, encouraging me. The song ended, and for the first time in years, the applause didn't make me cringe, it filled me with warmth. I stepped off the stage exhilarated, ready to run, to embrace whatever came next. But what happened next twisted my euphoria into darkness. The moment I got home, I noticed something strange. My journal lay open on my desk, pages flipping as if by an invisible hand. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of it. I approached cautiously, heartbeat quickening, inexplicably drawn to the sight. As I reached for it, it slammed shut. The sudden movement sent a shiver down my spine. I opened it again, only to find more entries had appeared. They were in my grandmother's handwriting, familiar yet unnerving. They detailed events that hadn't happened yet, enigmatic musings about music and loss, themes increasingly entwined with my own. Panic settled in quickly, but curiosity clawed at me just the same. Was this some trick my mind was playing? A way of grasping onto her memory? I couldn't help but read. Each day, I became more immersed in the journal, frantically scribbling notes, trying to understand these premonitions that felt so eerily real. The lyrics began to echo in my mind more insistently, almost as if they were beckoning me to play, to explore the emotion imbued within each word. The songs became darker, heavier, laced with sadness that was becoming almost palpable. A few nights later, while playing these new songs, I started to feel something, an energy that pulsed around me, almost tangible, a presence that felt familiar. It was intoxicating, yet terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was channeling something beyond myself. One evening, while I worked on a particularly morose ballad, the lights flickered violently, followed by an intense drop in temperature. I looked around, confusion flooding my mind. I could have sworn I heard her voice, clear and melodic, whispering encouragement, "Keep going." Heart pounding, I continued playing, pouring everything into the song. The piano keys danced as if possessed, harmonizing with my metal-stringed guitar, a jarring yet beautiful duet resonating through the room. As I played the last note, silence fell. The air was thick with anticipation before everything went dark. When I came to, it was morning. I was curled up on my living room floor next to my equipment, guitar still clutched in my arms. Confusion clouded my mind, but a chill ran down my spine. My phone was lit up with notifications, my social media flooded with messages thanking me for an incredible performance. I was bewildered. I hadn't played for anyone except those few fleeting moments at the mic, had I? But the comments were real, fans, friends, people I didn't even know were saying my music had touched them. They spoke of the raw emotion, the connection to loss and longing. It was as if I had shared a song that was meant for everyone, not just me. Days turned into an avalanche of messages and encouragement. I was thrust into a world of music I thought I had abandoned, and it took my loss to tie me to a community I had long ignored. I slowly contended with what this all meant, my performances, the inexplicable connection to my grandmother, the chilling energy surrounding me. Was it her spirit feeding my creativity, or was it merely my mind navigating the grief? But with each note played and each song penned in her journal, I felt strong. My passion reignited with suffocating intensity, teaching me a lesson in resurrection, that there is beauty even amidst the deepest sorrow. It transformed my pain into art, a testament to love's enduring nature, especially within the realm of music. Though her voice had faded, it left behind echoes, leading me home. I rediscovered my passion, and with that rediscovery came a connection to others, a reminder that love and music, no matter how separated we are by time, can always bring us back together. So here I am now, grateful for the haunting journey that led me back to my heart, intertwined with meaningful notes and lyrics that tell our stories, hers and mine. My grandmother taught me more than music, she taught me the essence of connection and expression, and for that, I will forever strum on, one haunting melody at a time. When my siblings stole my thunder, a family drama. When my siblings stole my thunder, a family drama. When my siblings stole my thunder, it wasn't just a momentary embarrassment, it became the catalyst for an unraveling that none of us anticipated. I should probably begin by saying that my older sister, Mia, has always been the star. From childhood beauty pageants to academic accolades, everything she touched seemed to turn to gold. I was the overlooked one, the shadow that trailed behind her. I would go through the motions, studied hard, but always in her shadow. Then came the year of my high school graduation. The evening of the ceremony was supposed to be mine, my moment to shine with my family beaming with pride. Anticipation built. My parents decorated the kitchen, balloons, and streamers announcing my achievement. But as the night drew closer, my parents received an unexpected call. Mia had scored a role in a major international film, she would be flying out to Los Angeles immediately. I remember the sheer joy in my mother's voice as she spoke with Mia over the phone and the way my father's eyes lit up in a way I had only seen during my own achievements. In the back seat of our family car, a knot began to grow in my stomach. The day of my graduation felt like a thin veil stretched taut around what should have been a joyous occasion. The ceremony happened as planned, but I'll never forget looking into the audience and seeing my parents enjoying the news of Mia's film instead of celebrating my special day. I walked across that stage, clutching my diploma tightly, but with every step, I felt like I was losing a part of myself. Sure enough, after the ceremony, we gathered at home, set up a small celebration just for me. My friends were excited, ready to cheer, but Mia's success loomed over us like an ominous cloud. On the kitchen counter lay my cake, decorated with congratulations. But it sat next to Mia's movie poster, hastily taped on the wall, its presence overpowering every variation of happy from my friends. I was slowly losing my voice in my own story. As the night wore on, I couldn't take it anymore. In a moment of frustration, I bolted upstairs and locked myself in my room. That night, I typed a fierce message to Mia, venting all my pent-up emotions. I pressed send, knowing it might ignite a storm. But I needed her to know the cost of her thunderstorm. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed violently with a response. "You're being ridiculous. This is my dream. Celebrate your own success instead of envying mine." I felt a whirlwind of anger and sadness mix in my gut, leaving me nauseous. I put my phone down and stared out of the window. The world outside felt so disconnected, even cold. That winter felt endless. Mia remained in LA, making waves while I sank back into the familiar role of the forgotten backup singer. Social media became my battleground. Every post, every tagged photo was a reminder of her glow overwhelming my struggle. I was slowly losing not just the battle, but the war for attention. Desperate, I turned to online forums. I poured my thoughts into anonymous posts, sharing pieces of my life under a pseudonym. I critiqued my family's dynamic, my sister's success that overshadowed mine, hoping for validation. Lurkers and commenters provided sympathy, some more than others, helping me feel understood. But in that anonymity, I found solace. One night, as I scrolled through no sleep, I realized something. It did not matter what was happening out there, I could create my own worlds where I was no longer the shadow. The forum became my salvation, a place where my stories could take flight without the restriction of familial expectations. I poured my bottled emotions into horror tales grafted from my insecurities, and to my surprise, people loved them. They thrived on the darkness spun from the very shadow that was stifling me. In a matter of weeks, my posts gained a following, fairy tale horrors that spun widely in the imagination of strangers. I could get lost in my stories where my characters were powerful, driving their own narratives, defying their backgrounds of invisible confinement. Yet, amidst my success, there was an eerie emptiness that began to cling to my heart. Sure, I was celebrating some form of victory, but it was furtive beneath my growing resentment for Mia. My posts turned into a ritual. I craved the validation from people I would never meet. But then, one dark evening, fate took another turn. It started on Reddit when a user sent me a private message. It was Mia. She had stumbled upon my anonymous posts and was hurt. "You don't even know me anymore." It was simple, cut deep. After checking my uploads and realizing how I described our family dynamic, how I painted her image in hues of arrogance and ignorance, I turned cold. I couldn't find words. I felt exposed. However, I just sat there, frozen, staring at her message as if it were a gaping wound. Then the next day, news broke that Mia was in a scandal. Videos leaked revealing her backstage meltdowns and entitlement, coupled with her rising fame. Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. People began to question the authenticity of the image she had cultivated. My world began to swirl, each revelation making her less of a beacon and more of a fallen star. As she faced her public, my own path became illuminated, filled with the stories I created. I began to open up more about my life, my truths as a shadow, turning pain into art. I gained followers who resonated with my moral tales, feeding me a sense of belonging I had long sought. But was my newfound voice birthed from her demise? It left stains on my conscience. One evening, Mia called, and I picked up, trepidation plugged into my chest. I discovered a frail fragment of the sister I once knew, a fractured soul clinging to her past identity while grappling with her present. Our conversation unfolded slowly, layered with insecurities, apologies for the hurt we each caused. It was a confession, the recognition of our battle as siblings overshadowed by each other's quests for acknowledgement. As we spoke, I realized the shared burden. We both felt like puppets in the family arena, one volatile thread feeding off the other's plight. We broke through that dark night, trading our perception of each other. There is nuance behind success and storms. We might have shared shade but didn't have to be enemies. Weeks passed, and amid all the throes of her scandal, the dynamics slowly shifted. I took steps toward my achievements unencumbered, no longer a shadow but a bystander cheering for the sky where Mia soared. Together, we moved through our narrative, co-authors rather than competitors. Isn't it striking how sibling rivalry can feel like blood on the walls of a haunted house? We each created our stories entwined yet distinct, experiencing thunder not as theft but a shared awakening. It's hard to find peace, but sometimes harmony is merely accepting each other's voices alongside our own, even as we wade through the chaos of family and the horrors of an unseen war. Each of us forever balancing the fine line of shared thunder, transcending the shadows to claim the light you embody, teasing the echoes of a raging storm to harmonize melodies instead of drown beneath them. When I was a kid, I never really fit in. I was the quiet one, always off to the side, observing rather than participating. I had my books and my imagination, they were my escape from the world outside, a world where I felt invisible. As I grew older, that feeling didn't fade, it just became more pronounced. High school was like walking through a minefield of social interactions, and I had no idea how to weave through it. But one cold November day, everything changed. It all started during lunch. I was sitting in my usual spot, a corner table in the cafeteria where I thought I had successfully made myself invisible. There was a commotion at the entrance, laughter and raised voices, and as I looked up, I saw a girl being dragged into the cafeteria by a group of girls. Her name was Sarah, and I knew her vaguely from my chemistry class. She was shy and always kept her head down. But today, she was different. Her face was a shade of red I had never seen before, and her eyes darted around in panic. The group that had her in their grip was the popular crowd, the kind of girls who ruled our school like a tyrannical monarchy. They pushed her down into an empty seat, laughing as if her humiliation was the best punchline they could come up with. I could see the tears welling in Sarah's eyes as they began to mock her about something that happened just last week. She had stumbled in the middle of the school hallway, her books spilling everywhere. I could feel the rage building inside me, but what could I do? I was nobody, and standing up to the group would only draw their ire toward me. But then something in me snapped. I remembered my own experiences of feeling like a punching bag for other people's amusement, and before I could think better of it, I stood up. I walked over to her table, my heart pounding in my chest. "Can you shut up already? Leave her alone." I didn't even recognize my own voice. It was raw and trembling but fueled by a sudden rush of courage. The laughter stopped as the group turned to look at me, their expressions shifting from surprise to fury. "Who the hell do you think you are?" one of them sneered. I didn't back down. "I'm someone who's seen how you treat people. You think it's funny to make someone feel worthless?" A few gasps escaped. I felt Sarah's gaze on me, and I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, something that was both surprising and terrifying. I was used to seeing only despair. The leader of the group stepped closer. "You better watch your mouth before you end up like her," she spat, gesturing towards Sarah. But something inside me shifted. Instead of quaking in fear, I stood taller. "You think you're making her feel worthless? Well, guess what? You're the one who's weak." There was an eerie silence as my words hung in the air, a charged moment where it seemed like the entire cafeteria had paused to listen. The girls exchanged glances, confusion etched across their faces. It felt surreal, almost as if I were watching this play out from outside my own body. After what felt like an eternity, one of them scoffed and turned on her heel, followed by the others, who reluctantly left. I could hardly believe it. My heart was racing not just from fear but from exhilaration. I turned to Sarah, whose face was streaked with tears but now glimmered with something else, gratitude, maybe? She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a spark of determination. "Thank you," she whispered. I shrugged, trying to play it off, though my insides were buzzing with pride. Over the next few weeks, a strange friendship blossomed between Sarah and me. We started hanging out after school, bonding over shared interests and our mutual sense of being outsiders. I found out she had dreams of becoming an artist, something she had never believed was possible for her. She showed me her drawings, each stroke was filled with raw emotion, and I was stunned. "You're really talented," I encouraged her, hoping the spark in her eyes wouldn't fade. To my surprise, my words deeply resonated with her. She held on to them as if they were a lifeline. Slowly but surely, Sarah started to shed her insecurities. She submitted her art to local contests, and shockingly, she won her first one within a few months. The day she called me, her voice almost breaking, I learned the power of belief, not just in oneself but in others, too. "I can't believe I did it. I'm actually going to have my work displayed," she exclaimed, and I felt a surge of pride welling inside me. That moment marked a change in her entire demeanor, a shift that radiated to those around her. The more confident she grew, the more her laughter filled the room, illuminating her previously timid presence. But with success came attention, both good and bad. Some of the girls who had taunted her tried to grovel their way back into her life, but instead of falling for it, she stood firm. With each interaction, I watched her become stronger, and it was contagious, as if her newfound confidence was seeping into me too. I learned to stand taller, to assert myself, and to value my own uniqueness. Then, in what felt like the culmination of our bonding journey, Sarah invited me to an art show where her work would be displayed for the very first time. I could hardly breathe when I arrived. The gallery was buzzing with people. As I approached Sarah's piece, I was choked up to see her dream materialized. As people moved around, absorbed in her art, she caught my gaze from across the room, and we both beamed at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. She had blossomed into the person she always was inside, and I puffed with pride, knowing I played a part in her transformation. But just as everything seemed to be coming together, something happened. During the show, someone from the popular crowd arrived, their eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Sarah. I watched in horror as they made their way straight to her, ready to pull her back into the torment she had fought so hard against. It was terrifying to see this familiar cycle. I felt my heart race. But Sarah's expression didn't waver. She smiled, and instead of cowering, stood her ground, ready to defend her newfound strength. "You can't control me anymore," she said, her voice unwavering. I was stunned. Where was the timid girl I had seen months before? In that instant, I realized the impact of our friendship, how we had both grown stronger together. It was a life-changing moment, not just for her, but for me as well. I, too, had learned to see my own potential beyond the shadows of my insecurities. We walked home that night together under a million stars, no longer searching for acceptance from others but finding it within ourselves. I learned that showing someone their potential isn't always about grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes, it's as simple as believing in them when they can't believe in themselves. Sarah taught me just as much as I had hoped to teach her, and from that day on, I realized we could be each other's anchors, no matter how stormy the seas would get. And perhaps that was the moment that, once hidden in the shadows of our insecurities, we could finally step into the light. I've debated sharing this story because it's still fresh in my mind, an experience that haunts me. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday. I was a junior in college, overwhelmed with finals and the pressures of life. I had always been the kind of person who prided myself on being self-sufficient, stubbornly thinking that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But on that day, everything changed. It was late at night, and the campus library was nearly empty. The clock ticked menacingly toward midnight as I pored over textbooks, trying to cram months of information into my sleep-deprived brain. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow that felt increasingly oppressive. I could feel a panic starting to set in, the walls of anxiety closing in on me. It was then that I noticed an older man sitting at a table across the room, engrossed in a thick book. He seemed out of place, a relic from another era, with a wrinkled face and glasses that slipped down his nose as he intently flipped the pages. Something about him caught my attention, but I dismissed it as a fleeting thought. As I struggled to focus, I began to hear whispers emanating from a nearby row of shelves. At first, I thought I was imagining things, a product of my exhaustion. But the whispers grew louder, distinct phrases tumbling into my thoughts. "Help me. Please. I can't do this alone." My heart raced, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I glanced over at the man, but he remained unfazed, still absorbed in his book. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to gather my things and get out of that library. But for some reason, I sat frozen, captivated by the whispers. They sounded desperate, filled with fear and longing. A heartbeat drummed steadily in my chest, urging me to listen. Gathering my resolve, I finally stood up, my body shaking slightly. I approached the shelves where the whispers seemed to emanate from, my curiosity outweighing my fear. As I rounded the corner, I spotted a shadowy figure crouched between the shelves, its features indistinct but its eyes wide and shimmering in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure looked up, tears streaming down its face, a frail, almost ghostly girl who couldn't have been more than 15. "Please help me," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I'm trapped. I need someone to pull me out." At that moment, I felt a wave of sympathy wash over me. I knew, as a college student, I was far from equipped to assist a child in distress, but her fear twisted something in my gut. "What do you mean trapped? Where are your parents?" I stammered, scanning the room for anyone else who might be around. "They went away. They left me here. But I can't stay here anymore. The library is not safe." The mention of safety sent a chill down my spine. "You really need to get out of here." "Come on," I urged, but as soon as I reached for her, a force stopped me. It felt like an invisible wall, paralyzing my limbs. The girl's expression shifted from panic to something predatory. "You don't understand. I can't leave. They're watching. They won't let me go." I stepped back, my mind racing. Was this girl even real? My instincts screamed to run, but there was a part of me that remembered how I'd suffered through anxiety all alone, convinced I didn't need anyone. "Please, just tell me how to help you." The air thickened around us, my heart hammering despite every rational thought trying to escape. And then the smile gracing her face twisted into something malign. "Help? Is that really what you want?" My mouth went dry. I just want to help you." It felt absurd to utter those words to a being I barely recognized. But it was as if those words unlocked a doorway. The shelves quaked around me, and suddenly, I was drowning in darkness, swallowed whole by the very library I thought was safe. I don't know how much time passed. When I came to, I was lying on the library floor, the distant sound of sirens ringing in my ears. The older man was now standing over me, concern etched across his weathered face. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the disorienting noise. "Are you all right?" he asked, extending a shaky hand to help me up. I grasped it, my body shaking. I saw someone, a girl. She said she was trapped." The man's frown deepened. "You must have fallen asleep. There's no one else here." I looked around frantically. No, she was real, she was right here. I pointed at the shelves, my heart racing as I searched for evidence. But everything was still and silent, as if a curtain had dropped over the scene. "I don't think so, kid. This library has a history, it swallowed many who sought refuge within these walls." My skin prickled at the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" I whispered, suddenly feeling a terrible weight press on my chest. "Students have gone missing for years. Some say they were lured by voices pretending to be help, but they were just tricks of the mind, remnants of anxiety or loneliness." I shook my head, his words hitting too close to home. No, this isn't just in my head. I can't be alone." The older man's expression softened, as if he could see my torment. "That's the thing, son. You're not meant to go through this alone. When you feel the urge to retreat, to hide, that's the moment you need to reach out. Ask for help. This place thrives on isolation." The realization hit me like a freight train. If I had tried to ask for help earlier, perhaps I would have avoided this encounter, or maybe it would have never happened at all. As if to emphasize his words, a cold breeze swept through the library, and for a split second, I thought I saw the girl's shadow flit away, her whisper echoing faintly, "Help me." Then it was gone, and the library felt more hollow than ever. I never returned to that library, and I reached out to friends, becoming uncharacteristically vulnerable, admitting that I needed help. Over time, I learned that asking might feel terrifying, but it was the only way I would remain whole. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Reach out before it's too late. Because sometimes, the help you deny yourself can lead you to the darkest corners you never wanted to explore. Just promise me, ask for help before it's too late. I didn't want to tell anyone about what happened that night, but I feel like I have to share this. It's been a few months since it unfolded, and I'm still haunted by the memory. So, here goes. I had been living in a small town all my life, everyone knew everyone, and life rolled by pretty predictably. I was just another face in the crowd, invisible to most, until Jenny moved in next door. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, charismatic, the kind of girl who could light up a room. For weeks, I watched her through my window, laughing with her friends, throwing wild parties that echoed late into the night. I never imagined I would muster the courage to talk to her, but in a twist of fate, we crossed paths at the local coffee shop. My heart was racing, and my palms were sweaty as I approached her table. She glanced up, those bright blue eyes catching me off guard for just a moment. We talked about the usual: her favorite books, the funniest things her friends had done. As our conversation flowed, I felt something spark between us. That daydream feeling when you find a person who seems to understand you deeply, even after just a few minutes. I took a chance and asked her out. To my astonishment, she smiled and said yes. Over the next few weeks, we went on a few dates, exchanged texts, and for the first time in my life, I felt alive. But one evening, while we were grabbing ice cream, I saw a shadow cast over her face. She hesitated before saying, "There's something we need to talk about." I knew what was coming. My heart dropped as she told me she was moving to another city for her dream job. The rejection felt like a punch to the gut. As she spoke, I felt my carefully constructed world around me shatter into pieces. Her eyes, usually bright and warm, appeared distant as she tried to explain that she didn't want to start something that wouldn't last. I was frozen, the words tumbling around in my mind like angry bees. I asked her if we could try long distance, but she just shook her head, her voice trembling as she said it wouldn't work. I tried to play it cool, to act like I was okay when inside, I was crumbling. Those final minutes were torturous. We held back tears, exchanging shaky smiles until she finally left. Alone in the empty nighttime streets, I felt like a ghost haunting the past. My days turned darker, food lost its taste, and everything I once loved became a reminder of what I'd lost. My friends tried to cheer me up, but their voices faded into the background. I roamed the town like a shadow, replaying every conversation we ever had, wondering what could have gone differently. Each passing moment seemed like a drip of venom, but I was determined not to let this defeat me. One night, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across an open mic night at a local cafe. I'd always loved to write, but I never shared my work. In that moment, something clicked. Maybe I could turn my pain into something meaningful. I signed up and began writing my heart out. I poured all my hurt, confusion, and anger into poems and stories, using every scrap of my experience as fuel. The day of the open mic arrived, and my nerves were on fire. But as I stood in front of the small audience, I felt a weird sense of calm washing over me. I read one of my pieces, a tale of heartbreak that spoke to a pain very familiar to me. The words seemed to carve through the silence, and people nodded along, visibly moved. After my reading, I received applause that felt like a warm embrace. That was it, I couldn't turn back. I realized I had found strength through vulnerability. Over the next few months, I kept writing and performing. I connected with others who had faced similar rejections, and through that shared pain, we lifted each other. I made friends who encouraged my creativity, helping me to embrace this painful experience. Each time I stepped onto that stage, I felt lighter, the chains of my heartbreak melting away. I started a blog, sharing a blend of my poetry and my journey. To my surprise, people resonated with my words. I received heartfelt messages from strangers, telling me how my stories helped them through their own struggles. I learned that rejection was a shared human experience, a brutal but necessary part of growth. Through that painful rejection, I had transformed, a strength had emerged inside of me that I never knew existed. Then one fateful day, I saw a notification that made my heart race. Jenny had liked one of my recent blog posts. Nervously, I opened her profile. She now lived in the city, her photos showing her thriving. I hesitated before messaging her. I didn't expect a reply, but a few hours later, my phone buzzed. "I've been following your blog, you've grown so much. I'm proud of you." My heart soared. The girl who once shattered my dreams was now congratulating me on building new ones. We exchanged a few messages, reminiscing about our time together, and I felt a strange healing in that connection. I invited her to visit, not knowing what I would say face to face. Would I tell her I missed her? Or that I've started to move on? When she did come back for a weekend, I felt that familiar spark ignite, but this time I knew I had changed. We spoke, caught up, and for the first time, I could see past the memories to the person standing in front of me. I realized how valuable that time had been, how much it shaped me. The night ended with a warm hug. It was bittersweet to see her go again, but without that weight of loss. I had won the battle against my own despair. Sometimes I think about how rejection can feel like the end, but it's often just a detour. And though I felt crushed, I discovered as I faced that rejection, I found strength in moving on, testing the waters of vulnerability, and embracing creativity. Now, I share this story not because I need sympathy, but because I want anyone who's feeling lost to know that they're never truly alone. There's power in the wounds we bear, and the ability to rise from them is within all of us. Embrace your fears and heartbreak. You may just find a strength you never knew you had. So, if you've faced rejection, remember, it's not the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning. It was a brisk autumn evening when I first met my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove. I'd moved into the old house next door a few months earlier, drawn to its creaking charm and weathered shutters. Mrs. Hargrove lived alone in a similarly aged structure that had seen better days. Between my work schedule and the bustle of daily life, I hadn't formed any connections in the neighborhood. I noticed her from time to time, picking up groceries, gardening, or sitting on her front porch, staring at the ground as if lost in thought. There was a certain resonance to her solitude that struck a chord with me. After all, I felt lonely in my new home, a feeling that clung to me like the omnipresent chill of the season. That evening, as I came home, I spotted her struggling with a heavy bag filled with what looked like bags of soil. She was just outside her gate, leaning against the fence for support. Without thinking, I rushed over, adrenaline sharpening my senses. "Hey, do you need a hand?" I called out, instantly wishing I hadn't interrupted her quiet moment. She turned toward me, her eyes wide, beneath graying lashes. A soft smile cracked her furrowed face. "Oh, dear, thank you so much. I didn't want to bother anyone." As I took the bag, I could feel the warmth of her gratitude envelop me, a fleeting glow in my otherwise stifling loneliness. I helped her carry the bags to her back garden, a feast of vibrant colors despite the encroaching cold, the flowers still defiantly blooming. As we unloaded, we struck up a conversation, sharing stories about how each of us had landed in this quiet corner of the world. She talked about her late husband, how they used to spend autumn evenings planting bulbs and reminiscing under a starlit sky. I shared snippets of my life, my recent move away from the city and how I missed the crowded streets and the anonymity they granted. She laughed softly, a sound that danced around us, infecting my heart with warmth. I felt an odd sense of ease. Our laughter filled the garden, mingling with the rustling leaves and distant chirps from fading birds, an unusual harmony in the cold air. As the sun dipped behind the trees, a chill settled in. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to shelter this raw connection, to keep it alive. "Can I help you tomorrow? Maybe planting some new flowers for spring?" I suggested, hoping I sounded casual when my heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear her response. "You're a kind soul, but I wouldn't want to impose," she replied, though there was a spark in her eye that told me she enjoyed the offer. "I insist," I said, buoyed by a newfound sense of belonging, energized by the prospect of time spent with another human being. The next day, I returned early with coffee and croissants, excited to share the treats that screamed of crisp mornings in the city. She accepted them with a grace that made my heart flutter. We worked hard, digging into the earth and planting bulbs, our conversations shifting from memories to dreams, each word binding us further. Mrs. Hargrove was wise and witty, her stories rich with experience. We lost track of time, and before we knew it, the sun was setting again. I lingered, the chill in the air creeping in like a ghost, but I found comfort, something I hadn't felt in a long time. "You're quite the gardener," I complimented, admiring her labor. "You might say it's a love letter to my past." We shared another laugh, and she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper deserving of secret keepers. "There's something I should show you," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to overhear. I followed her into her home, a dark and musty place filled with old photographs and dusty bookshelves stacked to the ceiling. It took me a moment to adjust to the eerie stillness. She shuffled intently toward a door at the end of a narrow hallway. My heart raced. What was behind it? A cautionary thought flashed through my mind: what if I was crossing a boundary? But curiosity drove me closer. She opened the door, revealing a cramped cellar filled with jars and strange artifacts. "I collect memories, dear," she stated, her voice mixing pride and sadness. As she began to explain the items, a rusting key, a cracked locket, a child's toy worn by time, I realized this wasn't merely bric-a-brac. Each item pulsed with the weight of long-forgotten stories, a history alive in her hands. I was captivated, each jar harboring a world I had known nothing about. I could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a tension thickening like fog around us. The small space buzzed with whispered secrets. It was as if the memories weren't just hers, they bled into mine, intertwining, spinning a web of connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. But the moment dissolved abruptly. A crash echoed around us, the sound of glass shattering jolted me. My heart constricted in my chest. "What was that?" I gasped, frozen in place. Mrs. Hargrove's face drained of color. "It's nothing, dear," she insisted, but I could see the fear creeping in, her hands trembling as she clutched a fragile locket. Something wasn't right. I turned toward the sound, swallowed by unease. "It's probably just the wind," I tried to comfort her, even as the words rang hollow in the dimly lit room. But her eyes darted to the door, a flicker of terror pulling at the corners of her mouth. "No," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "It's been locked for too long." A cold chill trickled down my spine, paralyzing every thought. I needed to leave, to break free from the clutches of dread pooling around us. I began, but before I could finish, a dark figure moved past the doorway, shadowy and swift, outside in the dimly lit hallway. My breath caught in my throat. "We need to go," I whispered, the instinct to protect bounding me closer to her. She shook her head, panic seeping into the air. "You need to go," she insisted, voice trembling. The door creaked behind me as a heavy silence settled. I wanted to argue, I wanted to protect her, to make sense of our whirlwind friendship, but fear clawed at my instincts. Somehow, more fear than I had ever felt before picked at my consciousness, urging me to escape. "I can't leave you alone," I urged. But Mrs. Hargrove's face hardened, her resolve apparent. "You don't understand. We can't let it out." I considered the air reeking of something ancient, raw. The unspoken between us lingered, and my flight instincts overtook my mind. I dashed back up the stairs and out into the yard, the cool air slamming into me, shocking my senses. I glanced back just once, the last glimpse of her trembling silhouette framed in the doorway, a captive of her own creation. I ran, not stopping until I reached my house, slamming the door shut like a barrier against the unknown. The darkness outside whirled, twisting into a chaotic breeze, leaving me breathless and trembling. I didn't sleep that night, not knowing what was swirling just behind the veil of our shared memories. I watched the shadows drape over my windows, half expecting a sinister hand to reach through, and in those haunting hours, I realized I had made a friend, but in doing so, I had stumbled into a world entirely uncharted, a place where friendship and caution warred for dominance. Days turned to weeks with an eerie stillness filling our neighborhood. Mrs. Hargrove ignored my calls, her house falling silent. I felt her absence keenly, a void that weighed heavy in my heart. Yet, eventually, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check on her. My resolve hardened. I approached her front door, taking a deep breath that seemed to gather courage from the leaves swirling around me. I knocked. Once, twice. No answer. But the door was slightly ajar, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The interior was cold, empty, devoid of the warmth we once shared. Anxiety seeped through my skin as I stepped inside, calling her name. I felt the same suffocating ambience from that day in the cellar. "Mrs. Hargrove." I called, my voice echoing hollowly through the dim house. There was no reply except the sound of something amiss in the air, a sound that resembled breathing but was much heavier. My chest tightened as I cautiously made my way to the cellar door. I needed to know, to face the truths hidden beneath the floors that hummed with fear. I peeled back the door, shivering against the chill, and ventured downstairs. The room where our friendship ignited now pulsated with a darkness that hadn't been there before. The jars were scattered, broken glass and memories intermingling like jumbled thoughts. I stepped cautiously, my heart a drum in my ears. And then, there it was, Mrs. Hargrove sat in a corner, clutching the fragments of the locket with tears streaming down her face. "It's too late," she breathed, her voice hollow and broken. "What have I done?" I stepped closer, my heart racing, fear battling the need to comfort her. "What's happening?" I whispered. She looked up, despair painted in her eyes. It's restless, it needs a soul. It wants to connect. Connect? What are you talking about? Panic surged through me. You let me in, and now it's gotten out. We've disturbed something old and dangerous. Every word hung like a pendulum, and dread settled deep in my core. Mrs. Hargrove, please, I begged. We need to fix this. I need you. But as her gaze fell, I realized I had crossed a boundary that shouldn't have been crossed. I tried to embrace her, to mend the distance growing between us, but she recoiled. You can't help me. You were never meant to see any of this. The floor beneath me shifted, an unsettling movement, a breathing entity between my feet. I stumbled back in horror as the room seemed to pulse with malevolence, the air thick with shadows spilling out of the cracks. I turned and ran, adrenaline fueling my escape. I flew up the stairs and burst through the door, slamming it behind me, sealing off the chaos below. The sun was setting, casting a sickly orange hue across my yard. I didn't dare look back at the darkened house that had swallowed my friend whole. For weeks, I lived in fear, the memories haunting me like a malevolent shadow creeping into the crevices of my mind. I locked my door at night, barricading myself against the what-ifs and regrets that whispered in my ears. What do I do now? Was the friendship I had sought worth the horrors lurking behind the fragile veil of memories? I kept my distance from the house, burrowing deeper into the numb comfort of my isolation. Yet each evening, as darkness unfurled its wings, I could hear the hollowness echoing through the trees. Mrs. Hargrove had vanished, leaving only an unspoken reminder of the fine line we tread between connection and chaos, and the cycle of friendship sometimes unveiling its sinister layers when we least expect it. I became a shell of my former self, and I wonder to this day if Mrs. Hargrove ever found peace or if some dark force now roamed free, an unfortunate ensnarement of my short-lived attempt to reach out, leaving me to carry the weight of an unknowing companionship forever scrawled in whispers and shadows, forever echoing the haunting truth of when I helped a neighbor and made a new friend. When I tried meditation for the first time, a transformative experience. I had always heard about the benefits of meditation, how it could help clear your mind and bring peace, but I never really believed it. My life was filled with deadlines, work stress, and the usual chaos that came with being an adult. One night, after yet another exhausting day, I found myself scrolling through Reddit in search of something, anything, to help me unwind. That's when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to meditation. The testimonials were glowing, people claimed it changed their lives. With a hint of skepticism but desperate for relief, I decided to give it a shot. So, I put on some comfortable clothes, dimmed the lights, and found a quiet spot in my small apartment. I had no idea what I was doing but figured I could at least sit still and breathe. I set an alarm for 20 minutes, closed my eyes, and tried to focus on my breath. To be honest, the first few minutes felt awkward and a little ridiculous. I could hear every creak of the floorboards and the distant sounds of the city outside. I kept thinking about work, about that report I hadn't finished, and how I needed to grocery shop tomorrow. It felt like I was trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Every time I grabbed onto a thought, it slipped away like it was never there to begin with. I was about to give up when I suddenly realized there was a deep rumble coming from somewhere around me. It sent a chill down my spine, but also ignited a flicker of curiosity. Tentatively, I tried to incorporate it into my meditation. I focused on the sound, the vibrations enveloping me like a warm blanket. Slowly, it morphed into something else, something almost melodic, and I found myself sinking deeper into the experience. The world around me began to dissolve, as if the walls of my apartment were made of mist. I don't know how long I had been in that space when I felt a presence behind me. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. Was it a ghost? Had I finally gone too far into the realms of meditation? I dared a peek over my shoulder, and the moment I did, everything changed. I was standing in an enormous forest shrouded in a heavy fog. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting into the sky like pleading hands. The hum I had felt earlier pulsed through this place, and for a moment, I felt no fear. Instead, a profound sense of connection washed over me. I stepped forward, my bare feet sinking into the cool, moist earth. As I wandered deeper, the sounds of the city faded completely. There were whispers in the air, a chorus of voices that seemed to be both inviting and warning me at the same time. Just as I thought I understood their murmurs, a figure emerged from the fog. At first glance, they seemed like a woman, though not entirely human. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent hue, and her eyes glowed softly, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. "You've come seeking peace," she said, her voice lilting and echoing. It felt like she was speaking directly into my mind rather than through the air. "But peace has a price." I froze, the gravity of her words sinking in. I had left behind my chaotic life in search of calm, yet here was a being who existed beyond my comprehension, telling me there were consequences to my desires. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, dread pooling at my feet. "Every doorway opened must be walked through, and every meditative state reveals truth." Her gaze pinned me in place. "Do you wish to see?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. In an instant, the forest twisted and warped, colors bleeding into one another. I was shown glimpses of my life, visions of loneliness, of moments where I had hurt others without meaning to, and the shadows of memories buried deep within. I was overwhelmed by sadness, guilt, and a raw vulnerability I had hidden even from myself. I fell to my knees in despair, feeling entirely exposed. "This is the price of peace," she said gently, "the truth lay bare. Only by facing it can you find true tranquility." I felt a weight lift from my chest, but it was soon replaced by a heavier sorrow. "I don't want to feel this," I cried out, my spirit breaking. "I just wanted relief." A soft chuckle echoed around me. Relief comes in many forms. When you confront that which burdens you, only then can you find balance. In that surreal moment, I realized the truth couldn't simply be pushed away or ignored. I had been living in a fog of my own making, suppressing my emotions, not wanting to deal with the impact of my actions. The trees around me began to glow, illuminating the shadows as if to say there was hope. I took a deep breath and began to understand that the pain I felt could be transformed into something powerful. As I absorbed this revelation, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I was pulled back through the forest, through colorful swirls that twisted and wrapped like ribbons of light until I stumbled back into my living room. My alarm buzzed, jarring me fully awake. I blinked, disoriented but changed. Everything was brighter. The weight I felt earlier did not vanish, but it transformed. It was now a call to action. I picked up a notebook that had been lying on my desk, and I began to write. I wrote about the shadows in my life, about the people I had hurt, the fears I had buried, and the need for forgiveness, not from them, but for myself. As I wrote, I felt lighter, as if I was releasing the tension with each stroke of my pen. The experience of meditation, the being in the forest, the ethereal woman, they all felt like echoes of a truth I was only beginning to unravel. It was the first time I truly understood that peace wasn't just about finding silence, it was about embracing the noise of our existence, confronting and accepting the parts of ourselves that may be hard to face. The next day, I reached out to those I had wronged, starting to mend fences where I thought there were none. I practiced meditation daily, each session unearthing a little more of the chaos within, and every time I faced it, I felt the fog clear just a bit more. I realized meditation wasn't just a practice, it was a journey. One that led me not only to tranquility but also to the strength buried deep within, a transformative experience that went far beyond any simple search for peace.
Every night at midnight, my golden retriever, Max, would stand at the threshold of the kitchen, his body rigid, tail tucked between his legs, as if an invisible force was pinning him down, and no amount of coaxing could drag him across that line. At first, I brushed it off as an odd quirk, maybe he was just tired after a long day of being my faithful companion, a never-failing shadow. But as the nights wore on, his fear deepened, transforming something once innocent into a wretched specter of dread. I tried everything, enticing him with treats, his favorite toys, even a gentle nudge, but he'd just whine, drool pooling at his feet, eyes wide with terror, fixated on the shadowy expanse beyond the fridge. It happened more so after I had inherited my late grandmother's house after her funeral, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that felt more mausoleum than home. I had chalked it up to some old wives' tale, perhaps the house itself held memories too heavy for a dog to bear, but as I lay awake on a restless night, I began to hear the whispering that slithered from the kitchen when the clock struck 12. It started softly, almost like the crackle of a twig outside, luring me with half-formed words, promising revelations just out of reach. My curiosity piqued, I armed myself with nothing but my phone's flashlight and ventured toward Max, who let out a low growl, a warning echoing through the silence that I foolishly dismissed. I stepped into the kitchen, coaxed by the sound now crescendoing, jagged syllables wrapping around my mind like a noose, pulling me deeper inside until I stood before the old-fashioned stove, its iron frame cold and dormant. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as if unseen eyes were penetrating my skin. I turned, expecting to find Max, but he was gone, his absence a sudden void that swallowed the air around me. In a panic, I backtracked to discover the kitchen door swung shut, and the echoes of my fearful breaths resonated off the walls as a hint of bitter frost brushed against my skin. I battered against the door, calling for him, each scream drawing the auditory shadows closer, until I felt him, my loyal friend, clawing at the other side, his whimpers seeping through the wood. Max. It's okay. I'm right here, I shouted through my desperation, but his cries grew more urgent, tinged with the purest fear that clawed relentlessly at my reason. Frustrated, I pounded on the door once again. Then came that moment, the bone-chilling silence that inevitably precedes the worst kind of revelation. Suddenly, the whispers erupted into cacophonous laughter, melding into a sound that gutted my insides, and I froze, still against the door at his side. With a final shove, the door burst open, and I was thrown back into the moonlit room as I watched Max rush past me, through the eerie flicker of shadows, toward the safety of the living room. I didn't even have the gall to feel relieved as I watched him bury himself beneath the couch, shivering like a leaf in the wind. In that instant, I was filled with dread, a sinking realization settling deep in my gut. Whatever had haunted my dog was still within those eerie confines of the kitchen, tethered just within the shadows. That was when I felt it, a chill creeping over the back of my neck, pricking my skin like a million needles. I dared not look back, but an instinct pulled me, as if it had woven its fingers into my very thoughts, drawing me back to the kitchen as if I were some mindless moth to a monstrous flame. This time, I summoned every ounce of courage and took a single step forward, only to feel something slithering around my ankles, coiling upwards like a serpent poised to strike. I yanked my leg back, my whole body trembling with terror, and that voice, now a hiss, filled the air as I grappled with the notion of running away, yet I was anchored in place. "Come and see," it beckoned sweetly, luring with a tone so duplicitous it tasted like lies. "It's waiting for you." The words rang inside my skull, and before I could stop myself, I was moving again, drawn toward the threshold. The air grew thick and suffocating, and as I stepped into the darkness, I was met with a sight that shattered my entire perception of reality, a mirror, but it was no ordinary mirror. It reflected a kitchen much brighter, almost radiant, yet uncanny, as shadows danced lithely around figures I could barely discern. They twisted and laughed, their faces a kaleidoscope of horror. Then, amid that blurred confusion, I saw him, my grandmother, her features soft and inviting, but her eyes, oh, those eyes bore the burden of dreadful knowledge. "You should join me, dear," she whispered, reaching out through the glass, her fingers grazing something just beyond the dimensional barrier. "Max has always felt it, felt the truth. Why don't you come see?" The moment her lips curled into an unsettling smile, I felt my heart plunge, the weight of her invitation suffocating, and as I scrambled backward, I heard my dog whine pitifully from the safety of the living room, struggling against the urge to protect me from things he couldn't express. The glass rippled as if resonating with my every wavering heartbeat, and as I turned to run, the whispers turned to screams, greedy and bone-chilling as they transformed into something monstrous. A cacophony became a legion of hisses that clawed at my sanity, and I fled, crashing into chairs, smashing frames against the wall, until my vision blurred, and I lost all perception of time in frantic, desperate motions. I found Max beneath the couch, and as I snatched him up, I realized this would never be the same. The shadows from the kitchen had reached out, had claimed a part of me. I shoved through the door, racing to lock it, my heart hammering against my chest as I heard that laughter anew, echoing long after I'd escaped. The whispers were now muffled, a dark promise lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Days blurred into nights, and even as I tried to forget, Max remained glued to my side, his gaze eternally fixed upon the kitchen door. But we both knew the truth. Every stroke past midnight unleashed nightmares, shadows creeping along familiar walls, turning home into something unrecognizable. And though I tried to shut it out, I could still hear that hiss, still felt the yearning pull. It begged me to come home. But for Max, for my sweet dog, I would never set foot near that threshold again. I couldn't bear to see him tremble once more, nor could I trust what lay beyond, lurking just out of sight, waiting for another midnight whisper to call us back into the depths of the kitchen where memories rotted like old food. And each night, just like clockwork, as the hands on the wall ticked ominously toward midnight, We sat in the living room together, praying for morning, hoping that whatever existed in that darkened kitchen would keep its wretched secrets to itself, for one more night.
I never imagined I would stumble upon the joy of gardening in the way I did. It started innocently enough one restless night when I found myself browsing through old family photos. My grandmother appeared in a faded snapshot, dirt under her fingernails, her face illuminated by the sun, surrounded by orange marigolds and lush green leaves. I'd spent my childhood summers at her house, watching her tend to her plants with a care I'd never understood at the time. That night, nostalgia washed over me, igniting something I hadn't felt in years, a longing for simplicity, for grounding. On a whim, I decided I would try my hand at gardening. With a sense of urgency, the following day I headed to a local nursery. The bright colors of flowers and the assorted shrubs felt overwhelming. I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as I navigated through the aisles. I bought a few potted herbs, basil, rosemary, and mint, and a pack of marigold seeds my grandmother used to grow. I didn't have a yard, just a small balcony in my apartment, but it was enough, I thought, to create something beautiful. I returned home and set everything up, arranging pots along the balcony railing under the afternoon sun. I felt exhilarated, like an artist finally standing before a blank canvas. For the first few weeks, it felt like therapy. I watered my plants daily, talking to them as if they could understand, coaxing them to grow. It wasn't long before I noticed small sprouts pushing through the soil. In that moment, I felt a sense of triumph that I had never experienced before. Yet, as weeks turned into months, something strange began to unfold. My once vibrant balcony garden started growing in ways I couldn't explain. The marigolds thrived almost aggressively, each flower bursting with color, but there were peculiarities. They seemed to flourish with such fervor that it almost felt unnatural. Other neighbors would comment on how beautiful my balcony looked, and I found myself glowing from their compliments. Then, one night, I was drawn to the window as I heard a soft humming sound, like a lullaby carried by the breeze. Curiosity piqued, I stepped outside and was enveloped in an otherworldly scene. My marigolds glowed faintly under the moonlight, pulsating gently as if they were breathing. The air felt thick, rich with an unseen energy. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was dreaming, but when I looked again, the flowers shimmered brighter, and I felt a strange connection, a tugging sensation in my chest. I spent the next few nights in awe, witnessing the flowers dance in rhythm with the hums that filled the air. It was intoxicating. I began to feel as though I was a part of something greater, something alive within the earth. The joy of gardening transformed into an obsession that went deeper than aesthetics or flavor. I soon learned about the lore of plants and their mystical connections to nature. The marigolds became my focus. I discovered ancient beliefs surrounding them, a symbol of protection, often planted to ward off negativity. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were guarding something, or perhaps, revealing secrets. But with every flower that bloomed, something shifted. One evening, while tending to the plants, I noticed a figure out of the corner of my eye. When I turned, I saw a shadowy woman standing on the balcony next door. She wore a long, tattered dress that danced in the wind like the marigolds, her face obscured by wild hair. She stared intently at my plants, her body swaying slightly. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. When I blinked, she had vanished. Shaking it off, I turned back to my garden, but the humming had changed. It felt darker now, no longer a soothing melody but a chaotic dissonance that vibrated through my bones. The next day, I decided to confront the strangeness head-on. I approached my neighbor. She seemed harmless enough at first, her voice soft and hesitant. She introduced herself as Esme, an avid gardener, and when I mentioned my marigolds, her demeanor shifted. A knowing look crossed her face, and she warned me about the nature spirits said to inhabit flowers, particularly marigolds. They can come alive if treated with the right care, she said cryptically. But don't let them take too much. Her words echoed in my mind as I returned home, unease creeping in. My once delightful garden began to take on an ominous presence. The marigolds bloomed so profusely that they choked out the herbs. I felt my connection to the plants shift, their vibrant hues turning thorny, their energy turning possessive. Esme's warning echoed deeper. I wondered what I had conjured with my newfound hobby. I attempted to remove the marigolds, thinking I could rein in whatever strange magic I had awakened, but it was as if they had taken root in my very soul. Each attempt to uproot them caused me pain, an ache in my chest as if the flowers were writhing in protest. Desperation surged as I realized I was losing control. With every passing day, I found myself more entranced by their glow, by the energy that seemed to pulse through my apartment. I stopped inviting friends over, growing more reclusive, and the humming became a dreadful dirge, pulling me from sleep, beckoning me into the moonlit world of my plants. The marigolds seemed to whisper now, their breath carried on the evening breeze, calling me to listen closely, to heed their song. I felt tethered to them, caught between joy and terror. One night, under a blood-red moon, the humming crescendoed, guiding me to the marigolds as they swirled and fluttered with a kaleidoscope of light. Frantic, I reached toward them, wishing to strip away the veil they hung between who I was and this strange new reality. As I touched the flowers, the world went dark. I woke to find myself surrounded by the marigold garden, but it was so much larger now, stretching beyond what my balcony had ever contained. The flowers loomed, shimmering with an iridescent glow, their hum rising towards a pitch that filled the entire air. I was no longer just observing my plants, I was a part of their world, and in that moment, I understood, the marigolds had absorbed everything I poured into them, turning my love into something primal and uncontrollable. They had awakened, inviting me to take a path that couldn't be undone. I had discovered the joy of gardening, but at what cost? I could feel my will fading against their power. That's when I realized I was trapped between fascination and fear, and all I could do was watch as the marigolds danced around me in an ecstatic frenzy, my heart racing as I was pulled deeper into their vibrant embrace. So, if you stumble upon an overly vibrant garden, take heed, there may be a joy lurking in the shadows that you're not prepared to uncover. I still remember the day my life changed forever, though it feels surreal to replay it over and over in my mind. It started like any other day, just a notch above mundane, packed with the repetitive cycle of waking up, getting dressed, and heading into work. I rushed through breakfast, hardly tasting the toast I shoved down my throat, all the while planning the 10 other things I needed to check off my list before jumping into bed that night. My commute felt more like a robotic maneuver than a girl in a city filled with beautiful moments. I was obsessed with speed and productivity, and life began to feel like a never-ending race. That's when the accident happened. The screeching tires, the crunching metal, the horrified cries of passers-by, everything happened so fast, yet time stretched infinitesimally in front of me as I sat in my car, paralyzed, gripping the wheel. I don't even know who was in the other vehicle, all I could think was the sheer terror of injury and potential loss. But when the shock subsided, I realized how lucky I was. My car was totaled, but I emerged with nothing more than a bruised ego and a cut on my forehead that throbbed irritably. After the adrenaline wore off, I was left staring at the shattered glass around me, but strangely, I could feel a gentle breeze. It did something to me, suddenly, for a reason that baffled me, the world seemed crisp and vivid. The blues of the sky melted my heart. The greens of the trees became electric. The conversations around me transformed into a symphony that filled my ears, but busy thoughts of deadlines came crashing back in. I was no longer just a woman who worked, consumed with success and ticking boxes. I started to notice the little things I had ignored for too long. For the first time in years, I looked forward to simple pleasures. Lunchtime strolls replaced hurried dinners. As weeks passed post-accident, I began spending weekends with my niece. Together we built sand castles on the beach, decorated them with shells and seaweed, and waited for the waves to destroy them. I watched her laugh, the kind of laugh that could only emerge from completely losing oneself in the moment, and I felt a twinge of envy. She was living a life I had forgotten existed. I started snapping pictures of our adventures, the way the sunlight danced in her hair, how she would scrunch her nose in pure delight after diving into the surf. I realized I wanted to capture not just memories, but the joy that glimmered within those fleeting seconds. One day, we decided to go to the local ice cream shop, a tiny place with peeling paint and a squeaky door, the kind that pulls you back to your childhood. While I waited in line, the smell of fresh waffle cones washed over me. I could hear the chatter of kids, their laughter slicing through the air like warm sunlight. My niece tugged at my sleeve, eagerly pulling me to the front, where she demanded cotton candy blue with sprinkles. As we stepped outside, she suddenly twirled in a dress that caught the wind, the world behind her bursting with color like a rainbow after rain. It struck me, she was embracing every moment. Then it hit like a wave, what if I didn't get to share all these moments with her? I thought back to that accident, it could have taken everything away. I had to learn to savor life, to savor each second before it slipped through my fingers. Fast forward to that stormy Saturday not too long ago. I woke up longing for a cozy day beneath the covers, but I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. It tugged at my heart, warning me that someone very close to me was about to leave this world. I brushed it aside. To be honest, that kind of intuition had never served me well. I opted instead for a spontaneous cafe run. On my way, I noticed an elderly man struggling where the sidewalk met the street. He was attempting to carry more bags than he could manage, bread and fresh vegetables teetering precariously as he hobbled along. I hesitated, on the edge of resolving my internal struggle, but managed to intervene just in time, offering my help. To my surprise, he beamed, a smile so wide it felt infectious. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson and invited me to share a seat at his favorite cafe down the street. I agreed, intrigued. Over warm muffins and steaming coffee, he spoke about his life, sharing stories of his wife, Clara, who had passed 5 years prior. Each memory he recounted overflowed with love, not sadness. I lost track of time, blinking back tears and smiling, laughing in tandem as we exchanged stories. Hours melted away until I finally noticed the sun setting in hues I had long overlooked, pouring golden light through the cafe window. His hands trembled slightly as he told me about Clara's laughter, how she would dance in the kitchen, twirling so effortlessly, leading him to join her and their children. I learned about how he expressed his love in the smallest of moments, folding laundry, preparing her favorite meals, savoring first-hand experiences while they played cards every Wednesday night. Suddenly, I remembered the feeling I had on the day of my accident. Life was fleeting, but we could either race through it like I had done for so long, or embrace it. When I finally left Mr. Thompson, the weight that had once pressed down on my chest was gone. It dawned on me then just how precious my little moments had become. The rush of love for life, for the people in it, made me understand something essential. Appreciation isn't just about what you see or do, it's feeling everything more deeply, experiencing the ordinary with breathless gratitude. I learned the risk that comes with focusing too much on future plans while letting these beautiful little moments slip away. That stormy Saturday marked a turning point. I invested in a new camera, not as a tool but as a lens through which I wanted to ensure I would remember every little laugh, every twirl of my niece, every story shared over coffee. The changes that blossomed quietly within me echoed loud and profound. This is how I learned to appreciate life's little moments, through the simplicity of connection, through the mundane, and the extraordinary that we often forget. In a world of chaos, each second gifted to us is not just a second but a chance. A chance to live richly, to breathe deeply, to love wholly. So now, I stand here with a heart expanding at the thought of living, and if you're still racing through life, I suggest you stop. Because the smallest of moments might just be the ones you never wanted to let go of. Don't wait until your car crashes to realize that. Embrace the moment. Live it. You never know how fleeting it may be. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. When I say I tried to be a hero, I don't mean the superhero, save the world type. I'm just your average person, someone who gets freaked out if I hear footsteps behind me in a dark alley or see a shadow move where it shouldn't. But that one night, I guess I wanted to step up, prove to myself that I wasn't some coward. It started as a regular Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten out of work and was taking the long way home to clear my head. I work at this tiny, dead-end office that feels more like a dungeon than a job, and I'd been wanting to shake up my life, do something that made me feel, I don't know, alive? So there I was, walking through the park, thinking about everything wrong with my life when I heard a faint scream echoing from a distance. At first, I tried to ignore it. Screams can be anything, right? Maybe someone saw a rat, or it was a couple messing around. But then I heard it again, sharper, filled with unmistakable fear, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should have just kept walking, called the cops, or even run in the opposite direction, but something inside me stirred. I wanted to help, to feel like I mattered, like I could be the one to make a difference, just this once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding harder with each step, and found myself weaving through the trees, each step crunching the gravel beneath me like an alarm telling me to turn back. It was dark, the kind of darkness that presses in on you, and the park lights barely reached the spot where the scream had come from. As I got closer, I spotted a figure, no, 2 figures, struggling in the shadows near the edge of a secluded path. I could barely make out what was happening, but it looked like someone was trying to pull away from the grip of a much larger man. instinct kicked in, and before I could even think about the consequences, I shouted, "Hey! Let her go." The man's head snapped in my direction, and the look he gave me froze me in place. His eyes were wild, filled with something dark, something dangerous, and for a second, I regretted every decision that had led me here. But then, the woman screamed again, desperate, pleading, and I couldn't just stand there like a deer in headlights. I lunged forward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a broken tree branch lying on the ground, and swung it at him. My aim was off, and he barely stumbled, but it was enough to get him to let go of her for a split second. She took off running, and for a moment, I felt this surge of triumph, like I was really making a difference. I'd actually saved someone. But that feeling was short-lived. Before I knew it, the guy turned his attention on me, and he was fast. Faster than I'd anticipated. He grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the tree with a force that made my vision blur. "You just had to play the hero, didn't you?" He sneered, his voice low and filled with venom. I tried to struggle, but he had me pinned, his grip like iron, and I realized just how powerless I was in that moment. The adrenaline that had pushed me to act had vanished, leaving me with nothing but a sickening fear clawing at my insides. He leaned in close, his face barely inches from mine, and I could feel his hot, rancid breath against my cheek. "You should have walked away," he hissed, and I knew then that I was in real trouble. Panic took over, and I tried to fight, kicking, thrashing, doing anything to break free, but it was useless. He was too strong, too determined to make me pay for interfering. And then, just as I thought it was over, something strange happened. He released me. Just let go, like he'd lost interest. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching at my chest as I watched him walk away without another word. Relief flooded over me, mixed with confusion, but I wasn't about to question it. I turned and bolted, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. When I got home, I locked every door and window, telling myself I'd dodged a bullet. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd never see him again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. For days, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows lurking where they shouldn't be. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, maybe I was just shaken up. But then I started finding things out of place around my apartment. Small things at first, like my keys being somewhere I knew I hadn't left them or the front door being unlocked when I was sure I'd bolted it. One night, I even heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease kept growing, gnawing at me. And then, one night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in what looked like red lipstick: "You should have stayed out of it." My blood ran cold. I knew it had to be him, the man from the park, but how had he gotten into my apartment? The locks were still in place, the windows sealed tight. I called the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry and dismissed it as a prank. I tried to convince myself they were right, that it was all in my head, but the fear wouldn't go away. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing right next to me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, and I forced myself to open my eyes, praying it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. There he was, standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me with that same twisted look in his eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch as he leaned closer, a sick smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could play hero," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "But heroes always pay the price." Then he was gone, just like that, leaving me alone in the dark, trembling, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the spot where he'd been, too afraid to move. All I know is that something in me snapped that night. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear, waiting for him to come back. I decided to confront him, to put an end to this once and for all. I started searching the city, going back to the park, retracing my steps, hoping to find some clue, anything that could lead me to him. Days turned into weeks, and every night, I'd return home exhausted, only to find more signs that he'd been there. More messages on the mirror, my belongings rearranged, my nightmares bleeding into reality. I became obsessed, barely sleeping, barely eating, just driven by this need to make him stop, to get my life back. And then, one night, I found him. Or rather, he found me. I was walking down an empty street, my senses on high alert, when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was him. "You're really making this too easy," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I spun around, fists clenched, ready to fight, but he just laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed down the street. "You should have left it alone," he said, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "But you wanted to be a hero. Now you get to live with the consequences." And just like that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaking, defeated. I went home that night, feeling more helpless than ever, realizing that he was right. I had tried to be a hero, tried to make a difference, and now I was paying the price. My life would never be the same. The night my life changed began with a simple invitation that I couldn't refuse. My friend Danny, an adrenaline junkie with an insatiable thirst for adventure, had organized a climbing trip to a local cliff known for stunning vistas. But for me, it was more than just a picturesque getaway. It was a daunting confrontation with my long-standing fear of heights, a paralyzing dread that had anchored me to the ground for years. As the day approached, vivid memories of panicked pleas and trembling knees flooded my mind, each brutal recall chipping away at my resolve. Nonetheless, I chose to embrace this challenge, feeling a strange mix of eagerness and dread. On the day of the trip, we arrived at the base of the cliff. It loomed before us like a titan, casting an intimidating shadow that swallowed me whole. The thrill-seekers around me were buzzing with excitement, their laughter ringing through the air, while I felt like an imposter, my heart racing as I stood transfixed at the foot of this monolith. Danny noticed my unease and offered a few words of encouragement. With a deep breath, I followed him as we began our ascent, hands gripping the rough, cool stone. The first few meters went fine. I was focused, methodical, and slowly finding my footing. But as we climbed higher, the ground beneath me seemed to recede into infinity. Each handhold became a potential trap, my vision narrowed, the air thick with anxiety. My hands shook and my breath caught as I wrestled with the urge to lose my grip and plunge into the abyss. I wanted to turn back, but Danny's enthusiastic shouts from above pushed me onward. Determined not to let my fear dictate my actions, I reminded myself why I was there, to conquer this fear, to see the world from a new height. Just as I reached a particularly challenging spot, I froze, paralyzed by fear. I could hear the wind howl through the crevices, and it felt like a warning. That's when I regretted not tapering my coffee intake. My heart threatened to burst. Suddenly, I heard a snapping sound, like a twig breaking. Surging panic filled my chest as I glanced down to see Danny perched on a broader ledge, and the enormity of my situation hit me like a freight train. I was way too high to turn back easily, and the realization clawed at my mind. I hesitated, unsure if I should move or stay still. In that moment, reality struck hard. The weight of the moment coalesced into something far more terrifying. I thought back to why climbing had meant so much to Danny. It wasn't about conquering mountains, it was about finding strength in adversity. Summoning a wave of determination, I closed my eyes and envisioned myself as someone unburdened by fear. Slowly, I began to climb again. I felt the warmth of the rock beneath my hands and focused on breathing, in and out, each breath a mantra urging me forward. As I reached the ledge where Danny waited, a triumphant smile spread across his face. "You did it. Not so scary, right?" he yelled. I nodded, though the truth was that I was far from relieved. Just as I was about to respond, the sound of distant thunder interrupted us, a dark omen that quickly became real. The sky overhead shifted from a clear blue to menacing gray in an instant. "We gotta get down, now," Danny yelled, panic spilling into his voice. I locked my gaze on the descending clouds, and dread pooled in my gut. I hadn't prepared for this, and the fear returned in waves stronger than before. As we scrambled down, the first raindrops splattered onto the cliff, and in seconds, a storm broke loose. The rocky surface glistened with treachery as we descended, my foot slipped, and I found myself hanging onto a narrow ledge. Time froze. In that heartbeat, reality blurred as I teetered on the edge of control. The roar of thunder reverberated in my chest. But somehow, instead of succumbing to panic, something shifted in me. I could feel a primal instinct rising, to stay alive, to thrive, to let go of fear. With newfound clarity, I pushed off and jumped to reach a more secure foothold, my heart in my throat as I barely made it. The adrenaline surged, completely blurring my fear. The rain pelted down, the wind howled, and in the chaos, I found strength I never knew existed. We moved together, focusing each other as we descended, slipping and crawling, but we never let go of that thin line of hope as we clambered to a safe spot. Just shy of the tree line, we finally stepped onto solid ground. A wave of euphoria flooded me as the storm opened above, the clash of thunder now a distant memory. I turned to Danny, and the sheer weight of relief washed over me. We were on the ground, together, alive. I had faced a raging storm, both outside and within, and I had emerged. Hell, we both had. The fear of heights still lurked somewhere inside me, but now it felt like an echo rather than a storm. I understood now that fear would always be there, but it wouldn't control me. We stood there, drenched in rain, but laughing, our voices mingling with the storm, and in that moment, I realized something profound. Overcoming fear doesn't mean it vanishes completely, it simply means learning to dance with it. The moment I realized I was in the wrong, a lesson learned. The moment I realized I was in the wrong is one of those memories I'll never forget, a crystal clear image burned into my mind, and though it's painful, I think I needed to go through it to finally understand the kind of person I was becoming. It all started innocently enough, with me, a typical young professional who thought he had everything figured out, from his career to his relationships. I'd landed my dream job at a high-profile consulting firm right out of college, a role I'd worked insanely hard to get, pouring every ounce of my time and energy into the endless projects and presentations. My job, as exciting and intense as it was, quickly became the center of my life, to the point where I started seeing everything and everyone around me as mere background noise. Friends would invite me out, but I'd decline, using work as an excuse, or when I did show up, I'd be on my phone half the time, answering emails, giving off that busy and important vibe that I'd grown to believe defined me. My family, too, got the short end of the stick. I'd skip family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, all under the guise of having too much going on and big things in the pipeline. If I'm being honest, though, I wasn't just busy, I was disconnected, isolated even, slowly pushing everyone away while telling myself I was on the right track. At first, I didn't even notice the subtle toll this was taking on my relationships. I chalked it up to growing up, being ambitious, going after my dreams. But over time, I began to feel this emptiness creeping in, a hollow feeling I tried to ignore by throwing myself even harder into work, filling my life with numbers, presentations, and meetings. Then, one day, my best friend, Danny, called me, saying he was going through a rough patch and needed to talk. Danny and I went way back to college days, but recently, our connection had faded. When he called, I was right in the middle of preparing for a huge pitch, and I could barely hide my irritation when he asked if we could grab a drink. I didn't even let him finish before I shot him down, claiming I had too much on my plate. He paused on the line, sighed, and said he understood, even though I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Later that night, I found myself replaying that conversation, something nagging at me, a tiny voice whispering that I'd messed up, but I brushed it off, telling myself Danny would get over it. A few weeks later, my sister asked me to come home for a family dinner, something we hadn't done in ages. She even mentioned how much my parents missed me, especially Mom, who'd been asking about me nonstop. I promised I'd be there, but when the day came, I found myself stuck in the office, buried under another pile of deadlines. I didn't even call to let them know I wouldn't make it. I told myself they'd understand, that they knew how demanding my job was. But then, something happened that shattered the illusion I'd built around myself. I came into work one morning, just like any other day, to find out that a young colleague of mine had been let go, someone I'd mentored, actually, someone who looked up to me and had reminded me a lot of my younger self. I couldn't understand why they'd cut him loose. He was talented, smart, and dedicated, but apparently, the firm had been making efficiency improvements, a sterile way of saying they'd cut costs by letting people go. It hit me harder than I expected, but I buried that discomfort too, telling myself that's just the way things are in our field. That same night, as I was walking to my car, I saw Danny waiting outside the office building. He looked different, pale, tired, almost haunted. I was about to tell him I was busy, that we'd catch up another time, but he cut me off, saying we needed to talk now. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we went to a nearby coffee shop, where he sat down and finally opened up. Danny told me that his dad had been diagnosed with cancer a few months back, and he'd been struggling to cope, feeling like his whole world was crumbling. He said he tried to reach out, tried to talk to me, but every time he called, I'd been too busy, too wrapped up in my own world. He even reminded me of that phone call a few weeks back, the one I'd brushed off so easily, and as he spoke, I felt a sickening realization settle over me. I'd been so focused on myself, on my goals, on my career, that I'd failed to notice the people around me were struggling, hurting, needing me. It wasn't just Danny, either. I thought about all the missed calls from my mom, the invitations I'd ignored, the friends I'd pushed away, all because I was convinced my work was more important than anything else. Sitting there, listening to Danny pour his heart out, I felt like the worst kind of friend. I wanted to apologize, to make it right somehow, but I didn't even know where to start. That night, I went home and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, haunted by the person I'd become. The next day, I called my mom and apologized, explaining everything, and for the first time in years, I heard her cry over the phone. I took a few days off work, drove home, and spent time with my family, reconnecting, mending the wounds I'd caused. It was awkward at first, like relearning how to be close to them, but slowly, it felt like coming back to life. I met up with Danny, too, and promised him that I'd be there, no matter what. And for the first time, I started setting boundaries at work, prioritizing the people who mattered instead of treating them like an afterthought. I learned a hard lesson from that experience, a lesson about what truly matters in life, and it wasn't the job, the title, or the money. It was the people, the relationships, the connections that make life meaningful. Looking back, I'm grateful for that rude awakening, as painful as it was, because without it, I might never have realized how wrong I was. I still remember the day I decided to step outside my comfort zone. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of day when the air feels charged with possibility, and everything seems alive with a hint of danger. I was curled up in my favorite armchair, wrapped in a thick blanket, binging episodes of a mindless reality show, the same thing I did every weekend. It was comforting, you know? A reliable escape from the everyday grind, but that day, maybe it was the full moon or some cosmic configuration, it hit me that I was wasting my life away in this bubble. So I decided to shake things up. I grabbed my jacket, threw on some shoes, and headed out the door, not really knowing where I was going. As I walked aimlessly through my neighborhood, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet seemed to echo the crunch of my own comfortable existence breaking apart. I ended up at this little community center I always passed without a second thought. It looked small and unassuming, painted a fading blue, surrounded by trees that were dressing up for fall and shedding their leaves in vivid bursts of red and orange. I approached the entrance, my heart racing with nerves. I hesitated at the door, thinking maybe I should just turn back, but something inside me pushed. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, greeted by a wall of warmth and a cacophony of chatter. A sign on the wall read, "Open Mic Night." Sweet relief mixed with excitement washed over me. I didn't have to perform. I could just sit back and enjoy. But as I scanned the room, my heart sank a little more. These amateur performers had real talent, a singer belting out a heartbreaking ballad, a comedian causing roars of laughter. I started to feel like the dull glow of my life was an embarrassment compared to their vibrant lives. That's when madness gripped me. What if I performed? I had always loved writing stories, spooky ones, especially. Maybe I could share one. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, every nerve screaming for me to retreat, but this primal urge pushed me forward instead. I found a pen and a scrap of paper tucked away beneath a grimy table and scribbled down my favorite short story, a creepy tale about a haunted doll. The more I wrote, the more confident I became. Suddenly, it was my turn. The spotlight cast an eerie glow around me, blinding me momentarily as I stepped onto the stage. My heart raced as I looked out into the crowd. A wave of doubt crashed over me, but I reminded myself I wouldn't stick to my comfort zone anymore. I cleared my throat and began to read my story. As I wove the eerie tale of the doll, I could feel the audience lean in. The eyes that had looked at me quizzically moments before were now wide with suspense, hanging on to every word. I felt a thrill coursing through me that I'd never experienced before. When I finished, the audience erupted into applause, and I felt a rush of elation that was absolutely intoxicating. I floated off stage, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I was on cloud nine, thinking maybe this wasn't so bad after all. After the show, people came up to me, complimenting my performance, and one guy even asked if I was working on a collection of stories. I was riding the high of validation mixed with the thrill of stepping outside my confines. But that's when things began to take a darker turn. A man approached me, his presence unsettling and intense. He wore an old, tattered jacket, the kind that looked like it had been a part of him for years, and his eyes were like two pinpoints of darkness that sent a chill down my spine. He leaned in closer and whispered, "You shouldn't be sharing those stories. You don't know who might be listening." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the feeling that he was serious. "Thanks for the advice," I said, taking a step back, but he continued. "You're tapping into something that shouldn't be unearthed." My heart raced as I glanced around for help, but the crowd was dissipating, everyone lost in their own conversations. I was all alone. Suddenly, I felt the need to get out of that place before I became rooted to the floor. I bolted for the exit, the shadows flickering ominously under the dim lights. The man called after me, his voice low and urgent. "If you must share, know there are consequences." My breath quickened, panic engulfing me. I pushed through the door into the night air, but the chill didn't come from the autumn breeze. I rushed home, the man's warning echoing in my mind, but when I reached my front door, I couldn't shake a burgeoning sense of dread. I tried to chalk it up to adrenaline and the absurd atmosphere of the open mic, but something lingered in the back of my mind. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, the man's words haunting me, taunting me. It felt as if the night itself had come alive. I could almost hear whispers on the wind, calling me back to that cursed community center. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the experience. I even stopped writing, afraid that it would bring the darkness closer. But the fears squatting in the corners of my mind only grew more intense. One evening, I was jolted from my thoughts when I heard a scratching at my window. I was paralyzed with fear, the shadow of doubt too heavy to propel me to investigate. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent, and I finally mustered the courage to peer through the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. Outside, staring at me with wide, hollow eyes, stood a doll, a cursed, disheveled, porcelain doll, just like the one in my story. The very likeness of the one I had described on stage that night. The connection twisted my stomach, and I barely could breathe. I backed away slowly, thinking it had to be a trick of my mind, but the doll remained there, motionless, a fixture in my view, its knowing gaze penetrating the very essence of my soul. I had brushed aside the man's words, and now his warning echoed ominously in my ears. What had I unleashed by sharing my story? I was thrust into a whirlpool of anxiety, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange man and what his warning truly meant. That whole night played in cycles in my head, every moment filled with sharp clarity as I realized I had pushed too far, breached a realm I knew nothing about. What had started as a small adventure outside my comfort zone had grown into a nightmare I couldn't escape. Days turned into a week, and still, I didn't dare step outside, my heart heavy with impending dread. I'd always been one to write my fears away, but now it felt like those written stories were manifesting. Every strange noise, every rustle outside my window, felt like ominous echoes of my actions. As I lay awake one night, panic-stricken, I resolved that I needed to confront the doll, my own creation haunting me. I crept towards the back door, trepidation clawing at my throat, determined to put an end to this madness. As I stepped outside, the air felt electric, charged with the same energy that had picked me up that October day. I approached the porch, my heart racing, and found it, sitting quietly on the steps as if waiting for me. Summoning every ounce of bravery, I reached down and picked it up. Its porcelain skin was cold to the touch, and with dread coursing through me, I muttered, "What do you want?" A sorrowful sound, almost a whisper arose, but I couldn't decipher the words. I clutched it tightly, preparing to confront my fears once and for all, and the whisper coiled around me. It became clear in that moment, the doll held my unspooled stories, all the threads of my imagination now twisted together, manifesting as this eerie figure. I understood then the man's warning, the lines I had drawn between fiction and reality had blurred. The fear I buried was now tangible. I released the doll, tossing it across the yard, but as it hit the ground, it shattered into countless pieces, plush memories of my lost creativity cascading around me. I stood alone in the night, a shroud of uncertainty wrapping around me. Maybe stepping out of my comfort zone unlocked something more than I anticipated, something dark and haunting. The dangers of those stories were very real, tapping into fears I had buried long ago. With my heart still racing, I turned to face the now empty street, returning to my home, my heart heavy but exhilarated. From that moment on, I continued to write, but with a deeper understanding that creativity is risky, and sometimes stepping outside that cocoon means unwittingly inviting the shadows to dance alongside you. What started as a stretch of courage opened a door I hadn't been prepared to confront. Sure, it paid off, I found my voice, but I also glimpsed the darkness dwelling in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder that every story carried weight, and some things are best left in the quiet corners of imagination. But, of course, that wouldn't stop me. Curiosity and creativity, much like fear, tend to intertwine, and who knows what will happen the next time I dare to step beyond.